thank you very much for joining us today. I am absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to have some expert panelists, some expert perspectives around the topic that we are discussing today, of how universities' reputation impacts audiences in a hyper-connected world. Hopefully that left enough mystery for you all to want to join us today. A very, very quick intro from me. I am the CEO of Access Intelligence Group. We are a global marketing communications technology company, and both Isentia, of which we have some customers on the call today, welcome, welcome, but Isentia and Pulsar are the sister companies within the group. We're going to use this opportunity to explore the concept of audience intelligence, which we believe is underpinned by the interplay between media and social intelligence and the conversations that are ultimately playing out online, as well as obviously offline as well. I'd like to introduce you to our lovely panel of experts. So perhaps we'll start with Dean. Dean is Chief Marketing Officer of Southern Cross University. Dean, please do jump in and tell us a little bit about your role and your experience in the industry.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today, and thank you to Access Intelligence for making it all possible. So I'm as Joe said, I'm the CMO of Southern Cross University. We're one of the smaller universities in Australia, but we're small but feisty, and we have a great time as an organisation, delivering university to our regional audiences in particular. I've had about 12, 13 years in higher education, marketing communications. I'm an ex-journalist by trade, and the portfolio that I oversee at Southern Cross University is quite diverse, and it's basically anything external to the university. So, whether it be social media, websites, communications, advertising, partnerships, philanthropy, student recruitment, all those areas, anything external to the university, I have purview over. Thank you.
Brilliant, Dean. That's really helpful. I think discussing the breadth of the stakeholders and audiences that ultimately sort of fall under your remit will be really, really interesting for people to understand better. Thanks. So moving on to Professor Anna Sullivan. She joins us from the is Director of the Centre for Research in Education and Social Inclusion. Anna, would you please kindly let us know a little bit about your role and your experience as well? I know you wear multiple hats.
I do, thank you, Jo. But as the director of a centre, this centre is probably one of the largest education research centres in Australia. So we have over 100 members doing a wide range of research that contributes to educational and social inclusion. So in terms of our audience, it's quite confusing. So slightly different to Dean, but sort of a subset of that is we're in social media, we're trying to talk to end users of our research. So it could be policymakers or teachers or principals or someone like that. But we're also trying to link with other academics and potential organisations that might want to use our research. So it's quite a complex sort of audience, really, in our space.
Perfect. Really interesting. It'd be interesting to delve into that in a little bit more detail. And our final panelist is certainly last but not least, is Francesco D'Orazio, who is joining us from is over in Australia at the moment, from the UK. Fran is co-founder and CEO of Pulsar. Fran, do you want to give us a little bit more background on your experience and potentially leaning in a little bit to talk about the vast range of universities that you've worked with globally?
Yeah, so glad to be here. Thanks for the intro. I have a social science background, and I specialized in studying audiences online, and Pulsar kind of like was developed as an offshoot of academic research in terms of developing tools for understanding how rumors spread online, and then it moved on to understanding audiences and understanding virality and how it affects perceptions of public opinion. So that all kind of like ended up being part of the set of solutions that we sell, and one of the kind of like biggest client bases we have is in academic institutions in EMEA, in the States, and now in Australia and New Zealand. Some of the academic institutions that we work with are King's College London, or the Oxford University, or now Otago University in New Zealand. So there's a kind of like range of examples that I can bring to the conversation that we're going to have later, but academic institutions use us in a in pretty much across all the different use cases that we normally cover. So it's quite an interesting kind of like subset, quite interesting vertical, because it's a microcosm of the different things that you can do with audience intelligence applied to that specific use case. So yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So coming back and maybe starting to talk a little bit about that audience piece. So audience intelligence, obviously this idea of being able to start to understand the very diverse audiences that ultimately make up public opinion or ultimately make up the key stakeholders in an industry. Dean, perhaps if we go to you first, can you explain sort of how varied, what the various audiences are that are key to Southern Cross, and also currently how you go about understanding those different audiences and then being able to communicate to them directly?
Yeah, sure. So we have like a lot of organisations, a diverse group of audiences, and future students is probably the single largest group that everyone focuses on. But even within that audience segment, there's very many components. There's school leavers, there's non-school leavers, and non-school leavers themselves can be 2 years out of school or 20 years out of school. So again, very different audiences as well. There's key secondary audiences as well around the influences of those primary audiences around parents and schools and employers. They play a very big role in our communications as well. And then extending further, there's the stakeholders such as other employers, partner organisations such as a TAFE college or something like that who might articulate students through. Then there's donors, people who provide funding for scholarships, and the government is also a very big stakeholder in our space as well. And we've spent a bit of time making sure that they're aware of us. In terms of communicating to these folk, well, one of the things about personalization in marketing and communications is something that's been coming for a long time, but it's very prevalent now. And what it means is that almost everyone has their own channel. And so it's really, really important that you have to be in many places at once with similar messaging, not the same messaging because they don't work in all the different channels, but you've got to be really consistent in your messaging, and it has to be changed for all those different channels. We use a lot of our own channels. We're finding that they're building up as communication channels very nicely, even our own website, our own email databases. But that third-party endorsement you get through conversations in social media channels, conversations in the media, conversations through other forums, they're really important to be aware of as well.
And how important are some of those international audiences to you?
Yeah, so the international audiences are more important now than they have been for the last few years, that's for sure. We've seen a bounce back of some of our international students since the borders reopened in Australia, and we're about 70% of where we were prior to COVID, when the borders shut, and many of our international students either had to go back to their home countries or stay in their home country if they're already there. So that's starting to change, and communicating that back to those audiences is really critical. And again, you've got different nuances within those audiences, and some of them are geographical. How you talk to a student in South Korea is different to how you talk to a prospective student in India, but some of it's also psychographical. I mean, we're talking about a group of 20-year-olds who see themselves probably having more commonality across those geographies than they do with people of different generations. So it's a pretty complex matrix 100%. That we have to work to sometimes.
Fran, I heard the word psychographical. I thought that was probably a perfect moment for you to jump in and talk a little bit about how you can actually start to explore some of those audiences, and use different affinities to start to pick up a really interesting picture that enables you to focus on different audiences and tailor messaging and communications.
Yeah, so obviously the whole kind of like pitch for audience intelligence is that there's a better way of understanding audiences that goes beyond what traditionally market research focuses on, which is a strong kind of like emphasis on the demographic side and the behavioral side when it's connected to, for example, consumption habits. And there's a lot that we can learn instead from kind of like cultural signals that we kind of like widely group into the psychographic space, which could be, what kind of TV shows you watch, what kind of magazines you read, what kind of fashion brands you follow or engage with. So when you bring all of these together, you get a really interesting cultural segmentation of your audience, which you know, in a kind of like a postmodern world has actually become slightly more predictive of behavior than traditional demographic features. And we kind of like built an engine to be able to do that. And for example, this becomes quite useful in situations like clearing, for example, which is quite relevant for the academic space in the UK, especially. There's a study we've been doing for a few years now, which is the Clearing Report, where we look at how audiences come together around this specific moment in academic British life, when there's a few places that get swapped and assigned by different universities to people that still don't have a place within an academic institution. And it's quite interesting to see what kind of audiences come together. And so when you are looking at, for example, the specific moment of the clearing phase in the recruitment life of an academic institution, is quite essential to be able to segment an audience not only by traditional demographic cohorts, but also by behaviors, expectations, or by, for example, the type of courses that they want to follow at university. So being able to have that flexibility, merging together those psychographic signals allows you to identify exactly the types of audiences that are for you available to reach when it comes to optimizing the outcome you want from the clearing campaign. And that's just a really good example on how this flexibility and the speed at which we can change the way we look at audiences and segment them in very different ways depending on the use case comes in handy for universities to be able to connect with their effectively their customer base.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we move to a different type of audience now, and we think perhaps about some of the other key stakeholders that play a part in shaping the reputation of the higher education industry, how do you navigate the sort of opportunities and challenges of those other stakeholders and the extent, obviously, to which they are a fundamental sort of component of the narrative within sort of universities? I'm thinking particularly in the instance, for instance, of government, Anna. Would this be an area that potentially you could talk a little bit to?
Yes, because I mean, universities sort of have two major foci. One is around students and the education of students, and the other is generating knowledge through research. So in our centre, which is focused on educational and social inclusion, we are interested in particular in generating knowledge that informs policy and practice. And when we look at who the major audiences are for that, it tends to be government, so higher education institutions, schools, preschools, and the like. There are other audiences, but government funds those in the main and directs the policies around that, and therefore the practices. And so government's a really important audience for us. And if you look at the complexity of government departments and how many there are, particularly in Australia, but also internationally, we're trying to inform education systems, organisations, and the like internationally. Like, it's quite a complex space, and so sometimes we're aiming at politicians in the main who can be directing sort of policy and departments, but also the long-term sort of departmental employee has a long role. So an important part of making decisions about what happens in education in relation to policy and practice. And so, but then we're also, if you look at school systems, you know, education, I think, is one of the largest sectors in Australia. You've also got teachers and principals, and we're also trying to inform parents so that they expect the right types of things happening in education. And so that's a really complex space for us. So we're using all sorts of mediums to try and communicate, one, that we're doing the research, and two, what the research is and what our findings are. And so that's quite complex, to do it across a range of areas.
Yeah, so thinking about that phenomenal amount of complexity and those, just the breadth of those stakeholder groups, which is so significant. How do you actually ensure that you can maintain authenticity across the different channels, and ultimately ensure that all of those different activities that you've got going on ultimately are, sort of all aggregating up to optimizing your reputation in the industry?
Oh, I don't know if we do a great job, but we're trying our best. So in a centre inside a university, so a dean's role would be across the university, and we have policies in the University of South Australia that sort of guide us and can support us. But basically at a centre level, we're running our own media, social media channels, campaigns, connections. We have our own YouTube channels. We have Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. We engage with the conversation. We engage with Masira, the media centre. So we're sort of all over the place. But then within that, we have 100+ members who often have their own sort of accounts and things as well. Or it could be research projects, which involves investigators from other universities. So that adds another complexity there. And how do we sort of promote the actual project as well? So I think it's quite complex. I don't know that we know a lot about it, actually, Jo, but our centre is trying to do that. I guess as a director, what I'm asking members to do is to also always foreground our centre, and which then foregrounds the university. So in a place in Adelaide, in South Australia, getting known around the world is critical to our reputation. We are, we're, I think, up there now in the top 100 in the world. And so the way we communicate internationally is a critical part of that, so that people understand the types of research we're doing, how good it is, and then use it in their policy to inform policy and practice.
So I am going to direct the same question to Dean, because again, bearing in mind you've got the whole, or more of obviously a major focus on the student side, you've got certain kind of key messages that are going to turn certain communities off, or audiences off, aren't going to be relevant to them. How do you maintain that authenticity across the various channels, recognizing that obviously it all aggregates up into the overall university's reputation?
I think there's a lot to be said for tone of voice, and it's a marketing term. I know that's a marketing term, but it's one that is, if you can get the tone of voice right, then that excuse me, if you can get the tone of voice right, then no matter where the communication falls, it's got the right vibe, it's got the right language, it's got the right tone. It's absolutely true that the words or the images that you use in one audience might be different for the other, but the tone and the representation of the university should be very, very similar. So a student who is studying remotely somewhere in Australia, or a student who's prospecting in Canada, or a research partner in Belgium, they should all have a similar feeling about the university. Their specifics will be different, but they should have a similar feeling about the university. And to Anna's earlier point, I'm a great believer in the Seth Godin concept of the smallest viable audience. And so you find the smallest viable audience. That doesn't mean a niche. That just means a person who's going to be a zealot for you. And so if you find that group, that people who really care about the work that you're doing, the research you're doing, the story you're telling, they then start the amplification process. And you may have to do that in a number of different spots. But it's really important that you connect with the right audience with the right message. The days of broadcasting and sending out to hundreds of thousands of people at a time and hoping that a small smattering of it resonates, that's a really 20th century approach to communicating, and a 21st century approach to communicating is far more niche and far more personal.
Well, I love that idea that you've described there, which is actually how do you find those fandoms almost within, different communities who can ultimately be acting as a sort of an amplification for you, which then again in itself, because it's coming from the community, feels even more authentic. Coming back to that kind of idea around some of those strategies, fandom being one of them, what are the strategies that you're seeing internationally, Fran, that universities are using to ultimately strengthen their reputation?
So I think to piggyback on what Dean was saying, what we've seen on, we've done a lot of studies on brand voice, and we've just finished one last year where we analyzed how different brands express their voice, their tone of voice, and their personality through social media. And
I can't read that.
the study, sorry. Sorry, and the study showed that there's a huge convergence in terms of like the tone of voice and the formats, then the tropes that different organizations are using, which is obviously leading to indifferentiation, which is leading to complete disconnect from the audience. And what became clear from that study is that the successful brands are the ones that are for some, but not for all. And so it's quite essential to be able to pick that specific audience and then deploy your tone through the lens of that audience. And then the audience will do the work for you, because we look at the audience as a prism that effectively translate your message into the different communities that are part of the audience that is relevant to you, but they do it through the lens of the structure of the audience and what they care about when it comes to what you do and how you live in the community. So the best approach is to go through the audience that connect to your identity in the most kind of like affinity, in the strongest possible affinity with your purpose and your tone of voice, and then let the audience do the work in a way. So as Dean says, the kind of like the age of broadcasting is over, simply because there's too much broadcasting going on. So unless you identify that connection and go via an audience that amplifies you, you're just not gonna reach them. And what we see works really well when you go with that approach that is kind of like audience first is that you effectively use the audience as the blueprint for your go-to-market. And what I mean by that is that if you look at a brand, the most specific thing about the brand is not the product, is not the identity, is not the design, it's not the tone of voice, but it's their audience. It's the audience, it's the cohort of people that basically coalesces around that specific proposition that makes a brand unique. So if you can learn from that structure and deploy the structure into the way you speak, into the subjects you cover, into the way you engage with an audience, then you are definitely going to have some success, because we've seen it in the numbers. Like when you map your go-to-market in terms of creative strategy and targeting strategy onto the structure of your kind of like key audience, that's when you have the best success. And that doesn't mean parroting an audience, that means being inspired by an audience. I think is a very fundamental difference. You're just not there to repeat what audiences are saying or just use the same words because you want to play it safe. You're there to just learn from them and be inspired, so that when you talk to them, you are on the same wavelength.
So one of the questions that's come from our audience, which we would have normally kind of left to the end, but actually plays really well into this point, is the point around the death of the cookie and the extent to which, with that demise, is it actually is there a way of effectively identifying and connecting with key audiences, and in particular with students? Just interested to get your perspective on that, Fran.
Yeah, so the idea is that you do that connection not on the basis of a one-to-one match to a person, which is what the cookie does, but you do it on the basis of a persona. And therefore, you can abstract from the specific individuals that the cookie gives you access to, but you can still refer to a type of person that cares about certain things, and then deploy that in the structure of your comms and your marketing. And a really good way of doing that is when we run reputation intelligence programs for some academic institutions like King's College London being one of them. And what is really important, for example, in those programs is that you have a structure for understanding what matters to you from a reputation standpoint. So you categorize anything that is coming through from the audience being played back about your identity into a bunch of dimensions like product and services, tech and innovation, performance, governance and leadership, or external engagements and affiliations, or your role in the community, or the health of your place as a workplace. And then you look at those dimensions through the lens of different communities in your key audience. And then you see what they play back, and then you see what dimensions are you perceived positively on, and what dimensions are you perceived negatively on, and why. And then based on that, you deploy different strategies with different audiences. That's what we mean by putting the audience at the core of your strategy, because you're effectively you have a framework for assessing your performance from a reputation standpoint, but then you apply an audience lens to that framework so that you can see what is working with which specific audience across that framework, and then you adjust based on the feedback. I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I think that's a really helpful kind of playbook on how to start to explore these different areas. So flipping it on its head, obviously we've talked a lot about the proactive management of reputation, but we all know that it's there's often a huge amount of time that's taken up for both comms and marketing teams trying to manage some of the more challenging sort of aspects of reputation management. Dean, can I go to you? What do you see as some of the biggest challenges when it comes, specifically, obviously, in the education, higher education, university space, when it comes to managing, the university's reputation?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that universities, by and large, are complex and typically very, very large organizations. And that would be the same for other big enterprises that have multiple departments and facets and thousands of employees and thousands of customers. So I think there's some parallels there. So I always say that, we have X thousand staff, they're not all angels. We have X thousand students, they're not all angels. There is going to be a problem somewhere along the line. The population split of good guys and bad guys is no different to university than anywhere else in the universe. So it's a given that something's going to go wrong. So I find it difficult when people are sort of blindsided by that. So you should have contingencies in place. And some of those challenges, they're around the efficacy of what you do. And so if there is an issue where the university finds itself in a challenging situation, there's three things that I say. You've really got to get to the warts and all behind the scenes as a communications professional. You really got to get to the warts and all of what the problem is. And I often say to people when there's an issue, tell me everything. Just tell me everything, even the stuff you don't want to tell me, because then we can assess what the risk is. We can assess what the implications are. We can assess the depth of this. And the other thing, it's a bit of a leveler, that if something happens in my world, it's really, really important to me. And it might seem catastrophic or it might seem celebratory, whatever the situation might be. That doesn't mean that it's going to have the same impact elsewhere. And that's why the communications professional needs to put that filter over it. Okay, who cares about this? Why do they care? And what are the likely sequences? And once you've analysed what the real crux of the matter is, what the likely ramifications or amplification of it is, then you can start mitigating. And I haven't yet seen crisis management on TikTok, but I reckon it's very close, because it's a massive channel. It's a massive channel, has instant pickup, has instant communication. Previously it might have been email, and that formal stuff, it's still really important to put an email on, put it on your website, all that sort of stuff. But if you want to get out there quickly, then social media and some of the even the mainstream media like radio, they can work out very quickly for you. So, but also if it's a TikTok-based audience that you need to manage or mitigate, then use that channel.
So that was going to be my question. I was going to ask, can you continue to be nuanced in the way in which you communicate, even in a crisis? So is it one of those things where suddenly en masse becomes important, or actually is it still really essential to have that authenticity around different audiences across different channels?
Oh, it's absolutely critical. I mean, if you're trying to tell people that either something's gone wrong and they need to know about it quickly, or that something's gone wrong and we're dealing with it, then we've all seen sort of catastrophes where the CEO or the CMO has got onto a curated video that they put out or something like that, and that's just not acceptable anymore. People are really wanting a genuine response. They're wanting authentic language. They're wanting authentic emotion. If the CEO is disappointed, the CEO should say he's disappointed, or her say she's disappointed. So it's really important that that the language, the tone, the channel is all consistent with the audience. I mean, you don't put a suited curate video on TikTok. You don't. But equally, you don't do a UGC thing on your email channels. You don't.
Totally. So one of the things I hear quite a lot from customers actually is, in that type of environment where there's a lot of pressure, people can feel quite paralyzed sometimes to know how to understand well enough the right message that's going to land first time with those audiences so that it can be really effective. Fran, do you have any thoughts around how you can use audience intelligence as part of that whole solution from a crisis management standpoint to make sure that the message that you land is sympathetic and ultimately isn't jarring potentially if it's used in the wrong context?
Yeah, I think the audience intelligence approach helps you in two ways. First of all, it helps you pick the battles, because in crisis management, the first thing you know is that you need to leave some battles, most of it actually. Most of the battles you don't want to pick. And then some you want to pick because you know that they affect the majority of the audience, or some key audiences that can make that problem spread elsewhere. But if you can see that the power of audience intelligence, you can see where the crisis is being focused on, and you can see which audiences are engaging with it, and therefore you can understand whether that problem is going to spread to some key constituencies in your audience or whether it's going to stay localized. And if it stays localized, you're better off not picking up the battle, because, with any battle, like with any fight in real life, the chances that you're going to lose are really high. So you don't want to get into a fight. And so the main rule is try not to pick the battle unless you must. And I think audience intelligence tells you when you must, because it shows you when the key core audiences are getting involved. The second way that this helps you is audience intelligence helps you understand how the narrative that led to that specific crisis came to be. And so you might see the crisis as, especially, for example, the tip of an iceberg. And then if you go back in time and you see how that specific crisis developed, and you can see it by analyzing the discourse around that specific problem, you can see that there's the rest of the iceberg underwater. It's actually all the reasons and all the emotions and all the factors that went into generating that crisis. So in a way, understanding that below the kind of like waterline iceberg, that helps you understand what elements do you need to address in your response to that crisis. Because if you just address what's the tip of the iceberg, then people are going to get back to you with all the things that are implied and that got to that point. And instead, if you know how the narrative developed and what elements went into it, you can address them head on, and therefore diffuse any kind of like further escalations that might come from you not acknowledging some problems that led to that specific crisis. So, and that for me is as important as not picking up a fight, like understanding the implications that led to that crisis so that you can address them in your response. Is the best diffuser of any fight.
Yeah, and coming back to Dean's point about, obviously, you're always going to have, some challenging situations internally that can ultimately impact reputation. We're also cognizant that that broader stakeholder group does also go on to impact the reputation of an industry. Coming back to that point, Anna, can we talk a little bit about what if the crisis or potentially the negative tone of the reputation is actually coming from one of those key stakeholders like government, i.e. one of their policies potentially isn't seen as being particularly beneficial or effective for the university for the university industry. Is there any insight you can give around working with other stakeholders, major stakeholders who ultimately make up the industry narrative, especially in the context of supporting reputation and managing negative consequences?
I mean, government is constantly setting policy. So at the moment, there's a great deal of reviews going on around higher education policy and also school education sort of policy and practice, which is both at a bit of a crisis. And so as academics, what we want is sort of research informed policy development. But unfortunately, sometimes the time pressures and various other things get in the way of that and in the way of people making research informed decisions. And so, what we try to do is try and make it a bit easier, but it is quite hard for us as well, because it's not our key role. So, we would put in submissions, for example, into inquiries and the like, but drawing on the support of comms people is ideal, but we often don't have those resources there. So we'll often put pieces out, say in the conversation or media releases, responses and things, try and educate the media so that they can put sort of influence what's going on in around the policy development as well. Yeah, it's pretty complex for us to try and inform policy development and the big issues. So the Accord's a good example at the moment, with the Higher Education Accord, and how do we sort of inform that? And in education school systems at the moment, there's a teacher shortage crisis, a huge inquiry about that. But I think, unfortunately, in the space that I work at, in education, everyone's a little bit of an expert on that. And so because they have had some experience with education and formed opinions around that, there isn't a big appetite for research-informed information. So when things get reported in the media, coming back to crises, you know, I've had things reported in the media of findings from research studies around student behaviour and what teachers can do, and you can get slammed. Like, there can be an absolute media strum around that. And sometimes what has to happen is universities have to lock down the social media. There can be death threats. There can be all sorts of things that can happen to individual researchers because they have engaged with the public. And so there's a fine line between that. It's not always about messaging, but how do you manage, I guess, and support the people who are delivering messages and engaging with the media to do it in a good way. But even if it is in a good way, we've got a responsibility around the public. And, you know, what is probably less discerning public at the moment in terms of what should be, how messages should be interrogated, you know, what is actual research, what's an opinion, and that plays back to government when it's making decisions around policy and practice. So it's all connected, I think, at the moment.
And you've obviously really hit the mark with a number of our attendees on the webinar, because the Q&A has suddenly really hotted up, Anna. So another question for you. People are really keen to understand what trends in your research you've seen on social inclusion and the effect it has on reputation.
Oh, that's a big question. I mean, social inclusion at the moment, we've got high levels of poverty, high levels of unemployment, people who have no housing and can't find it. That impacts on, say, teachers trying to get a job. They can't go places because they're living in caravan parks. They're feeling threatened. So the complexity of our society at the moment, that's just opening up in terms of travel and international travel and the like, is pretty extreme. And we've got a lot of kids in Australia living in poverty. So what does that mean? Currently, you know, puts everyone under pressure. But in long term, it's a real issue that needs addressing. And so for higher education, you know, we're one of the few countries that doesn't give free public education. You know, that's an issue that needs to be considered as we're thinking about what we do. Even school education's not free in Australia. There are expenses that are around that. And there aren't many countries that do charge people for the education. And so what that means at the moment is pretty extreme. Student numbers to enrol in universities are down across Australia, particularly in certain areas. So that's playing out with the unemployment rates and being quite so low. It's just extremely complex. And what that means then is you need complex solutions moving forward. And sometimes that takes a lot of time and a range of experts to come to the table to help understand, you know, what to do around particular things.
No, that's incredibly insightful. I think just expanding that question out a little bit more to you, Dean, one of the questions that seems to have built on that comment was around what can universities do to adapt and respond to the industry changes and disruptors like what we're seeing in terms of the overall cost of living in Australia at the moment, pandemics, the outsourcing of digital courses, ChatGPT and the such like.
Yeah, it's a complex external environment, isn't it? Look, I think the universities in Australia, particularly in the last generation, have shown themselves to be very adaptable, and they've shown themselves to be very robust. And the pivot that, to use that word, the pivot that universities did in 2020 to accommodate online delivery during the pandemic that was rapid and effective. It was effective. So we still had people graduating. We still had people completing their research. We still had people, completing their studies and undertaking their thesis and that sort of thing. And it was one change after another, because as you know, the pandemic wasn't linear. It went up and down quite a lot. And then even as we came out of the restrictions of the pandemic, we had a lot of natural disasters across particularly the eastern seaboard of Australia, and various universities were involved in either directly being affected or having to interact with communities at work. So I think universities have found themselves to be very, very adaptive, really important organisations within communities, really, really important beyond just their educational impact. They have really established themselves as part of the fabric of these communities. So I feel that these big changes coming our way, ChatGPT, Sydney, and various other AIs that are emerging, I see them as the forefront of something more that's going to come. I've been through a number of industries that have had to pivot and change, and some have disappeared almost, and some have resurrected. I've been in the tourism industry. I've been in the media industry. They've had massive changes, but they find a new level. They find a new level, and it's different, and there is pain to go through. And I think universities, they came in 2012, they went into the demand-driven system. That went on for about 6 years, and then now there's a capped funding environment, but it's still fairly open. So there's a lot of changes in the way that universities have had to adapt to their whole business model in the last 10 years. Anna mentioned the Universities Accord. That's another one that's underway right now. There's a discussion paper out that universities are responding to. Some of them are prosecuting their arguments publicly, some more behind the scenes, but they are adapting to what will be a new relationship between universities, higher education, and the government, which is the main funding body for universities in Australia. So that's going to change again. And I think universities have proven that they are able to move and adapt. There's countless conversations going on about how artificial intelligence like ChatGPT is going to impact on assessment, exams, communications, blogs, all that sort of stuff. Even the writing of essays by students. There's all sorts of discussions going on, and who better to lead it than universities who are immersed in a productive outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really nice sort of statement to finish on, almost in some senses, is we are seeing an enormous amount of change in both online and digital trends for higher education. But the last 3 years have shown us that there is phenomenal adaptability in the industry, some incredible bright minds that come together to fundamentally ensure that services and education still reaches the various different audiences and communities that are critical to the industry. So I'd like to say an enormous thank you to all of our panelists. We've actually gone a minute over time, but it's been a really lovely organic conversation. So I haven't wanted to sort of jump in too much and steer it. It's been really, really interesting. We have managed to cover off through various sort of conversations we've been having our different audiences questions. So thank you so much to all of you. It's been blowing up, but I've made sure that I've steered the conversation to answer as many of those as possible. So from all of us here, thank you very much for joining us today. And we look forward to discussing more and more the opportunities that audience intelligence holds in supporting the building of reputation across the university sector.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you.